Last time we spoke about the beginning of Operation Ichigo, the war on the Burma front, and the war in New Guinea. Hundreds of thousands of IJA troops stormed countless areas in China. Chiang Kai-shek was caught somewhat with his pants down. His best men were in Burma. There was little his defenders could do against such raw power. Xuchang fell, and soon the Japanese were marching upon Luoyang. Over in Burma, the British, Indian, American, and Chinese alliance was continuing to both attack and defend. In the north, Stilwell led the offensive, while Slim led the defensive in the south. The Chindits fought like lions to defend White City, but ultimately they would have to give up strongholds to seek new ones. Over in New Guinea, the Japanese continued their frantic retreat under heavy pressure from the Australians. As bad as the situation was, the Japanese were in for a very nasty surprise in Green Hell. This episode is the invasion of Western New Guinea. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. Before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I just released part 3 on my series on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. This episode titled Operation Jinzhou. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel where you can find exclusive podcasts. The next exclusive podcast is actually going to be a very wacky story on the Battle of Castle Itter, one of the more bizarre battles of World War II, where Americans would find themselves fighting alongside Wehrmacht against the SS. You heard that right, so come over to check it out. Last week we saw the effective conclusion of the Eastern New Guinea campaign. It was a colossal campaign beginning with the Australian defense along the Cacao Track. Then there was the bloody battle for Bunagona, the drive upon Les Salamaua, the march upon the Hainan Peninsula, the Finistères, and then the taking of Madang, which basically ushered in its end. Yet while the book was closing upon the eastern part of New Guinea, the book on Western New Guinea was just about to be opened. The pace of the offensive against the Japanese in New Guinea accelerated greatly in the first half of 1944. This was primarily because General Douglas MacArthur feared unless he made quick progress, he would lose the reins over where the Allies would be driving upon the Japanese home islands. MacArthur, of course, sought to advance upon the Philippines, while the Joint Chiefs of Staff favored the Navy's central thrust more so. Despite MacArthur's continuous war against his colleagues and superiors, and his continuous complaining that he lacked support, he had been provided the means to carry out numerous amphibious assaults that could lead to his ultimate goal. MacArthur's operations against New Britain, Sador, Los Negros, and Manas clearly indicated Allied superiority over the Japanese in terms of men, ships, and air power. By April of 1944, MacArthur had nearly 750,000 men under his command. His major components were 6 U.S. infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, 3 separate regiment combat teams, and 3 special brigades. Now, the Australians were gradually being relegated into a secondary role by this point, but could still provide 5 additional divisions, and enough separate brigades to form another 2 divisions. General Kenny's Air Force had grown so large they could now mount 200 aircraft raids against a variety of targets with little fear of Japanese retaliation. But what MacArthur really needed was more and more forward airfields, so he could hurl fighters and bombers deeper into the Japanese inner perimeter. In a lot of respects, the Japanese position in New Guinea was all but hopeless. Although they still had more than 350,000 troops in the southwest Pacific area, many were now isolated with little chance of receiving reinforcements, let alone supplies. There was also an enormous amount of confusion amongst the various commands. There was also the enormous distance and lack of effective naval power. Overall command of the Japanese forces as far as Wewak was technically under Lieutenant General Fusataro Tsushima, with his HQ at Manokwari on the Vogelka Peninsula. It was Tsushima who ordered General Adachi to withdraw his 18th Army over to the Hollandia area. Fortunately for MacArthur, Adachi procrastinated heavily, believing a landing would actually be made at the Hansa Bay area. All of this heavy bombing by the 5th Air Force against the coast near Wewak supported his beliefs. Not too long ago we spoke about Operations Reckless and Persecution, the invasion of Hollandia and Iipe. Admiral Barbie had already departed the staging points and rendezvoused northwest of Manus Island by April the 20th. The large convoy sailed west from the Admiralty Islands until dusk, whence they turned southwest towards Hollandia. Admiral Mitscher's Task Force 58 was providing escort while also launching strikes against Wakte, Sarmani, and the Setani airfields on April the 21st. Over the next 3 days, the carrier aircraft neutralized the remaining air power in the Wakte-Sarmani area. Early on the 22nd, the two task forces separated, with the Persecution Task Force heading southeast towards Iipe, and the rest, designated Reckless Task Force, proceeding to a point 20 miles offshore between Humboldt and Tanura Bay. Now, the Allied troops were ready to hit the beaches, but awaiting them was a large concentration of Japanese. However, it was mostly a concentration of Japanese personnel rather than actual combat troops. While the initial attention was focused on the Gilving Bay area, the 2nd Area Army Command was also concerned over the weak condition of the defenses at Hollandia, which lay just east of the 140th meridian in the 8th Area Army Zone of Responsibility. An order to dispatch an element of the 36th Division to that sector was issued, but was quickly revoked on the grounds that it would weaken the defenses of the Gilving Bay area without appreciably strengthening Hollandia. A large section of the New Guinea coast between Wewak and Sarmi thus remained practically undefended. General Anami promptly dispatched a staff mission to the 8th Area Army headquarters at Rabaul to press for reinforcements of the Hollandia area, and a similar recommendation was communicated to the Imperial General Headquarters during December. 2 battalions of the 6th South Seas Detachment, temporarily stationed on the Palau Islands, were dispatched by High Command. The force arrived to Hollandia on March the 4th, but numbered only 240 men, since approximately 1,000 men, including the detachment commander, had been lost en route to submarine attacks. No other action was taken, however, since both the 8th Area Army and the 18th Army, after the loss of Finschhafen, were more immediately concerned with checking further enemy penetration of the Damper Strait region. Thus, roughly 10,000 IGA and 1,000 IGN personnel were at Hollandia. Most were support units led by Major General Kitazono Doyuzo, and aviation units from General Enaida's 6th Air Division. When Tsushima ordered Adachi over to the Hollandia area, he had procrastinated. This prompted the leader of the 2nd Area Army, Anami, over at Davao, to become concerned. Anami sent his chief of staff over to Wewak to convince Adachi to pull out, but when Adachi finally began withdrawing, he only had 2 regiments on the trail by the time of the American landings against Hollandia and Iipe. Major General Toyozo only arrived to the area 10 days before the invasion, and for an unexplained reason, he never officially took command. Thus, this is why Tsushima's appointed air officers, Inada, ended up being thrown the command. Inada only really had 500 effective combat troops, mostly from the 6th South Seas Detachment. These units belonged to General Anami, and they had been recently transferred from Manchuria to oversee the defenses over the eastern part of the Dutch East Indies and Western New Guinea, and for the projected and later cancelled invasion of Northern Australia. And you know what? I just want to make a small side note here, because I recently made a YouTube short on my channel, the Pacific War Channel, about the cancelled invasion of Australia idea. And I just have to say, it was embarrassingly wild. Basically, to summarize it, there was just a few guys in the Navy who, for some reason, thought that it would have been a great idea to invade the northwestern part of Australia, even though there was no real reason to do so, and it wouldn't have really done anything. And the Japanese army, well, let's just say they had some criticism about it, and it was pretty funny. But back to the story, Anami's command was now formally around the 2nd, 18th, and 19th Armies. Lieutenant General Kitano Kenso's 19th Army had been garrisoning Timor, and the Lesser Sunda Islands, Sumbawa, the Bandia Sea Islands, and some key points in northwestern New Guinea, with their HQ located at Ambon. Lieutenant General Toshima Fusetaro's Second Army, as I had mentioned, was assigned overall defense of Western New Guinea, with Lieutenant General Tagami Hachiro's 36th Division landing at Sarmi and Biak in early March, and Lieutenant General Ikeda Shunkinchi's 35th Division preparing to come over to Manakwari. The 14th Division, originally part of the Second Army, was diverted to defend the Palau Islands. To further support the Second Area Army was also Vice Admiral Endo Yoshikazu's 9th Fleet, 3 Southern Expeditionary Fleets, and the 7th Air Division of Lieutenant General Sudo Inozuke. Over at Hollandia, the headquarters of Admiral Endo and Generals Kitazono and Ineda had arrived at about the same time by mid-April. Although General Adachi had placed Kitazono in formal command of all of the units there, the transport commander had no time to really develop a comprehensive defensive plan for Hollandia. Thus, as I had previously mentioned, command really fell onto Inada and Endo. The Japanese would be woefully unprepared for what was about to come. Over at Iipe, meanwhile, there was just a handful of replacements from the 20th Division, along with some naval and support personnel, so the situation looked even worse for the 1,000-man garrison. Preceding the amphibious assaults, Admiral Crutchley's surface fleet was going to shell the Tanura Bay area, while Admiral Mitcher's carrier planes bombed the waters off the Tanura beaches to explode possible mines, also finishing off the Hollandia airstrips and remaining aircraft there. Admiral Crutchley's warships picked up their landmarks through the mist as best as they could, and around 6 a.m., the roar of 8-inch guns from heavy cruisers HMAS Australia and Shropshire shattered the silence of the steaming tropical morning. To this din was added the sharper crack of 5-inch and 4.7-inch weapons from the American-Australian destroyers. The fire continued until 6:45 a.m., by which time 600 rounds of 8-inch and 1,500 rounds of 5-inch and 4.7-inch ammunition had been expended. As for the aerial strikes, despite the unfavorable weather, Task Force 58 managed to maintain planes on air alert over the Hollandia area since dawn. No enemy aircraft flew up from the Hollandia fields, and few apparently operational planes were sighted on the strips, and those were strafed at. In general, there was no indication that the Japanese defenses nor defenders existed in the Tanura Bay area. Task Force 58's scheduled bombing and strafing missions for that region were therefore cancelled. Meeting very little opposition, LCVPs carrying the first wave of the 19th and 21st Regiments approached Red Beach 2. As the leading wave of LCVPs approached Red Beach 2, which was obscured by smoke from the naval bombardment, a rocket barrage was laid on the landing area by the 7th Fleet LCIs and 2 landing craft of the 542nd Engineer Boat and Shore Regiment. Machine guns mounted aboard the leading LCVPs kept up a steady stream of fire against the beach. There was no answer from the Japanese. The only opposition to the landing was a scattered amount of small arms fire and light automatic weapons fire from points far off the flanks of the beaches, and from the small island in Tanura Bay. The enemy fire was so quickly silenced by supporting destroyers that the assault waves suffered no casualties reaching the shore. Thus, tactical surprise was achieved in the Tanura Bay area, as the Japanese had only a few lookouts in the sector. General Irving's 24th Division successfully landed, and the 3rd Battalion, 19th Infantry, quickly secured the northern portion of the beachhead and immediately dispatched patrols east and north to probe suspected enemy positions. The 1st Battalion followed the 3rd ashore, went into the assembly area to act as a local reserve to make it ready for the unloading of supplies at the water's edge, and this proved necessary. The 2nd Battalion, 21st Infantry, took the southern half of Red Beach 2 with similar ease. The 3rd Battalion of that regiment quickly followed the 2nd ashore and sent Company I south to look for a trail, expecting it to connect Red Beach 1 over at De Papre. Simultaneously, LVTs carrying Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Clifford's 1st Battalion 21st Regiment crossed some coral barrier reefs on their way to Red Beach 1. Clifford's men landed completely unopposed and would spend an hour trying to locate a road leading to Lake Santani and to her airfields. Clifford left a company at the beach while the rest trekked it over to De Papre, Lake Santani Trail at 8:37 a.m., still encountering no enemy opposition whatsoever. Moving through the fire lanes down which no bullets flew and past pillboxes in early stages of construction, the battalion column reached the village of Maribo at about 10:47 a.m. There was only a few scattered enemy rifle shots that had been encountered during the march. The village was secured without any opposition. Over 3 miles by trail inland from Tupap was Maribo, and this was the 24th Division's first inland objective. It was evident from the scattered Japanese equipment in and around the Maribo area that the Japanese had recently evacuated the village, not long before the 1st Battalion's arrival. Colonel Clifford halted his men. Since radio communication with the division command post on Red Beach 2 had been lost, he sent some messengers back over this kind of tortuous trail to report the progress back to General Irving. At the same time, patrols were sent towards Kantome, nearly 2 miles southeast of Maribo. They reported a few signs of enemy activity along the trail beyond Maribo. Colonel Clifford apparently did not wait to reestablish contact with the higher headquarters, but acting on his patrol's reports, he ordered the battalion to just push on. Encountering little opposition along the main trail, the unit reached Kantome about noon. When Irving arrived to Red Beach 2 at 9:30 a.m., he found a major logistical problem had formed at his main beachhead. Behind the narrow beach, a wide, impassable swamp was discovered. It covered most of the area that the men had planned to use for the bivouac and their supply dump. Thus, the supplies soon began to pile up on the beach. This was an especially serious circumstance, for the landing plans had called for moving almost all troops and supplies overland from Red Beach 2 to the road inland. Construction of a road between the two beaches was soon found impractical, and when after a day and a half of hard work, engineers had succeeded in driving just a few yards of road into the hills south towards Red Beach 1, the project was discontinued. The small completed stretch did not serve any useful purpose. On D-Day, 2 batteries of 105mm howitzers were dragged along the road as far as possible to a cramped position on a little ridge immediately south of Red Beach 2. From this site, the howitzers could deliver some fire support for troops advancing inland from Red Beach 1, but the direction of fire was limited by a number of hills nearby. The same stretch of road also provided dispersal space for a few of the many vehicles which had been unloaded at Red Beach 2 on D-Day. Additionally, a limited dispersal area rendered inaccessible by a small stream and by an arm of a swamp was discovered at the northern edge of the beach, and ultimately the 542nd Engineer Boat and Shore Regiment constructed a road into this space. Artillery ashore within an hour after the initial landing was in place there to deliver fire on the inland targets. But the fill used to build this road stopped the flow of the little stream, which had drained the swamp into Tanura Bay. To prevent a rise in the swamp's water level, a drainage canal was cut directly through the center of the beach. This procedure speeded the outward flow of swamp water, lowering the water level a little, and it created a small additional dry area behind the beach, but it did not provide sufficient dry land for dispersal of the troops and supplies scheduled to land at Red Beach 2. Eventually, Irving's men found some dry, flat dispersal areas behind the beach, allowing the supply shuttles to continue their work uncongested. Again, it is the very unsexy tale of logistics during war. But it's this kind of information that's actually crucial to know. And might I say, the logistics of World War II, more specifically of the Pacific War, are such a marvel to even think about, that many commanders today say nothing has even come close to it. Most of the military actions, even today, would not be as complex and dynamic as what was seen in the Pacific War. It was simply such a colossal task. Colonel Clifford's battalion would make the main thrust for the division, while the remainder of Colonel Charles Liman's 21st Regiment moved over to Red Beach 1. Colonel Clifford possessed little to no knowledge of the situation to the rear, other than the difficulties presented by the terrain. Ahead, 10,000 or so Japanese were thought to be concentrated around the airfields. Jankino was a flat, swampy ground and was not easily a defendable position. Should the 1st Battalion push on to Dazai, onto some flat ground, Japanese troops might outflank the unit, cut their lines of communication to Depapre, and destroy it at leisure. If the Japanese bypassed the battalion, they could cut off the advance of the rest of the 21st Infantry at any one of the many defiles over to the first 2 or 3 miles of the trail inland from Depapre. Colonel Clifford therefore decided to pull his men back to Kantome for the night, leaving only outposts along the trail east of the village. Kantome was located near the foot of the Takari Hills, which he thought would present a serious obstacle to any Japanese flanking maneuvers. It was a fortunate decision, as at around midnight, elements of the 22nd Airfield Battalion had advanced overland around his 1st Battalion's outposts, striking at their left flank. Meanwhile, General Heavey's landing craft carrying the leading waves of the 162nd and 186th Regiments, supported by rocket fire and by Rear Admiral Russell Berkey's cruisers, likewise met no Japanese resistance as they landed General Fuller's troops on White Beach. Company A of Colonel Harold Haney's 162nd Regiment rapidly secured Cape Pi, while Company I of Colonel Oliver Newman's 186th Regiment secured Cape Drury. With Jaffa Bay in hand, Newman's 3rd Battalion then landed at White Beach 4 in preparation for an advance towards Limac Hill and Pim. The first objective, Limac Hill, lay 1,800 yards northwest of Pim. Part of the battalion secured the hill by 10 a.m., and other elements advanced southward towards Pim. The village and its usable jetty were secured against light opposition by 4:45, while Circuit Brood Hill and Jaffa Bay south of Pim were cleared by 6 o'clock. The danger that enemy troops atop the dominating heights near Pim might make White Beach 4 untenable was over. The 3rd Battalion then established a night perimeter at Pim, extending its defenses along a trail leading west from the village to a point at which the Pim-Hollandia track joined the main road inland to Lake St. Annie, thus securing the roadhead from which movements to inland objects had begun. Over at White Beach 1, Haney's 3rd Battalion advanced quickly to take Pancake Hill at around 8 a.m., only meeting sporadic rifle fire. After taking the hill, they began pushing up the shores of Humboldt Bay, encountering no resistance as they advanced upon Jermoya Hill. It seemed clear to the Americans the Japanese had been taken by complete surprise, not expecting an amphibious assault against Hollandia so quickly, so they had pulled back to the St. Annie Lake airfield sector. Now further south, Haney's 2nd Battalion were advancing to a track that connected Hollandia with Pim, trying to make contact with the 3rd Battalion over at Jeremiah Hill. Meanwhile, Newman's 1st Battalion was advancing upon Limac Hill, though the men wanted to keep pushing towards Hollandia during the later afternoon. Fuller decided to dig in for the night while warships and artillery softened up the city. When General Aname, over at his HQ in Manado, heard of the invasion, he immediately ordered the 23rd Air Flotilla of Rear Admiral Ito Yoshiaki to toss whatever he could against the Allied surface ships and against the forces along the beaches. He also ordered the 18th Army to break through to Iipe, to rush over and help Hollandia's garrison, and for General Tushima to dispatch a regimental force as well to Hollandia. Thus General Tagami got his 224th Regiment together for an advance to Hollandia, expecting to get there for early May, while General Nakai's 20th Division continued to close in on Iipe. Anami also wanted to send his main part of the 36th Division to perform a counterattack in Hollandia's direction, as he thought it would be vitally important to delay the enemy as much as possible, so a better defense of Western New Guinea could be organized. Yet General Terauchi Hisaichi of the Southern Army declined his request to do so, on the basis a counteroffensive would simply denude the already weakened defenses of Western New Guinea. Meanwhile, General Do's Persecution Task Force was carrying out their landing against Iipe. The landings would be preceded by naval gunfire from Captain Albert Noble's destroyer force, aerial bombardment from escort carriers of Rear Admiral Ralph Davison's Task Force 78, and from General Kenny's Air Force. Meeting zero resistance and under the cover of rocket barrage, the LCPRs landed the men of Colonel Francis Mason's 163rd Regiment by 6:45 a.m. Despite the lack of resistance, an immense amount of smoke and poor visibility prevented the troops from landing at Beach Blue, and instead they came ashore at Wapil. Just like at Hollandia, they achieved tactical surprise at Iipe, as the Japanese fled in a panic under naval gunfire. Mason got his 2nd Battalion to swing west and quickly seized the Waitanen Creek, while the 1st Battalion was to be landed. Then the 2nd Battalion formed a defensive position at the Pro Mission, while the 3rd Battalion sent patrols east to establish an outpost near the mouth of the Nagaya River. Back over at the beaches, General Doe landed some Australian engineers who began repairing the Taji fighter airstrip. The No. 62 Works Wing Royal Australian Air Force had come ashore at Blue Beach during the morning and had been able to start work at the Taji fighter strip at about 1 p.m. Repairs continued throughout the night under floodlights. The lack of Japanese opposition and the urgency of the task prompted General Doe to push the men on. Although it had been hoped that the strip would be ready for its use on D+1, terrain conditions were such that the necessary repairs were not completed on schedule. Thus, it was 9 a.m. on April the 24th before the Australian engineers, who had worked without break for almost 48 hours, could announce that the airstrip was ready. At 4:30 p.m., 25 P-40s of the No. 78 Wing, RAF landed on the field and the balance of the wing arrived the next day. The ground on which the fighter strip was located was so poorly drained that it was not until April the 28th, after steel matting had been placed on the field, that it could be used continuously. The work wings then moved to the Taji bomber strip to aid the 872nd and 875th Engineer Aviation Battalions. The later two units had passed the operational control of Wing Commander William A.C. Dale of the RAF, who, besides the commanding of the work wings, was Persecution Task Force engineer. Extensive repairs were necessary at the bomber strip, and the field was not ready for the use by fighter and transport planes until May the 27th, and for bombers not until early July. Again, the very unsexy world of logistics. But every single island, the Americans or Australians for that matter, take over, getting closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. These have to be secured using air power, mostly. Thus, the building of airstrips is probably the most important aspect of any of the Pacific War campaigns. Again, whenever you read books about the Pacific War, especially primary sources from U.S. Marines, veterans, and such, you always hear them praise the Seabees, and this is exactly why. If they're able to erect some of these airfields, it's going to protect the guys on the ground, heavily. While the engineers worked, Colonel Merle Howey's 127th Regiment also landed, while Mason's men expanded the perimeter further west, securing the incomplete Taji West airstrip and at the mouth of the Rahu River by the end of the day. Simultaneously, Colonel Clifford's men continued their advance from Kantome to Sabran, whereupon Fuller finally decided to launch his own assault against Hollandia, while Colonel Haney's 2nd and 3rd Battalions rapidly moved down the ridge to seize the abandoned town by 11:15 a.m. Over to the south, Colonel Newman had his 1st Battalion pursue the fleeing enemy, and in the process rapidly secured Brinkman's Plantation, and then repelled a very uncoordinated Japanese counterattack by the 6th South Seas Detachment and General Kitazono's 42nd Independent Motor Car Battalion. At 8 a.m. on the 23rd, the 1st Battalion left its night positions on Limak Hill and started out over the main track, passing through the 3rd Battalion. The movement was supported by the 205th and the 218th Field Artillery Battalions set up near Cape Pi, and by aircraft from the carriers of Task Force 58. By 9 a.m., the 1st Battalion had reached Brinkman's Plantation about 2,200 yards by trail southwest of Pim. So far, there had been zero opposition. Now, Companies A and C parted from the main body to patrol northwest up to Borgonji River. Proceeding to a fork about 2,000 yards upstream, the two companies repulsed a series of uncoordinated attacks which were launched against the right flank of 186th Infantry during the afternoon by Japanese forces estimated to be about 150 men. The two companies remained at the stream branching during the night of the 23rd, and on the later day they moved overland southwest to rejoin the main force at the Pim Lake Setani Trail. Meanwhile, General Inada's aviation personnel already at the Setani airfield, alongside those currently retreating there, were cut off from their ration and ammunition supplies, which happened to be stored near the coast. Facing the hopeless situation of having to conduct a proper defense of the airfields with less than a week's worth of rations, little small arms, and machine gun ammunition, no artillery at all, and two different enemy forces converging upon them, General Inada seized full command and he led the weak garrison to retreat towards Genjem. Their rearguard was provided by General Kitazono's troops. During that afternoon, two platoons of Clifford's Company B, leading the advance from Sabran, safely crossed a small stream but found themselves in the middle of a very well-concealed Japanese ambush on the east bank. Rifle and heavy machine gun fire made the stream's steep banks untenable, and the forward platoons hurriedly withdrew to the west, leaving 4 dead men behind. In response to this, Irving's artillery and Admiral Mitcher's carrier aircraft began to bomb and strafe the area, but Clifford's B Company was nonetheless unable to break through. An artillery duel emerged that night, keeping the men of the 1st Battalion wide awake. They were also being supplied with great difficulty via hand carry over the Depapre Lake Sentani Trail. Fortunately, the 24th Division's plans for Hollandia's operation had taken into consideration many of the potential logistical problems that might be encountered in the Tanura Bay area. The divisional G4 section had made a detailed study which had shown a full infantry regiment could be supplied by hand carry from Red Beach 2 over to the Depapre Lake Sentani Trail inland as far as Jankina. When no road connecting Red Beach 2 with Red Beach 1 had been found, the division moved the main supply point to Depapre, from which the advance inland would be supported. With this change in the plans, the G4 section undertook new computations and calculated that the hand carry distance could be extended to Dazai. This conclusion was based on the assumption that adverse weather conditions would not make the Iipe-Lake Sentani road nearly impassable. On the 23rd of April, heavy rain started to turn the road into a quagmire, through which struggling men could scarcely carry their own equipment and food, to say nothing of the extra supplies for the leading battalion. By the evening on that day, logistical support of the 21st Regiment had therefore become a major problem. There was no question, but the regiment would have to be supported by hand carry, for it was estimated that at least 2 weeks of hard work by the engineers would be required before the road from Iipe as far as Naval would be made passable even for the jeeps. But the 1st Battalion had already advanced east to Dazai, beyond which point, according to the G4 estimates, support by hand carry would be next to impossible. Because of these logistical issues, General Eichelberger decided to make the Humboldt Bay area the principal task force landing site, allowing the 41st Division to drive further inland. On the 24th, Newman's 3rd Battalion passed through the 1st and seized the Guayabo area, only stopping there until the 2nd Battalion came over to reinforce and continue the advance. During this action, however, most of the Japanese continued their retreat towards Genjem unmolested. Over in the west, Irving ordered Clifford to consolidate his forward positions around Ceylon and Dazai, as he now realized the continued rapid advance inland was no longer possible as a result of the hand-carried logistics scheme, and the weather was taking quite a turn for the worse, hampering airdrops. Back over to Iipe, Mason's troops crossed the Raiu River, and by midday the 2nd Battalion secured the town. However, General Doe was dissatisfied with the pace of the westward advance, and therefore he suggested to Alamo Force that the 163rd's commander, Mason, be relieved. This step was approved by General Kruger, although the regimental commander remained in control of his unit until May the 9th, only 2 days before the 163rd Infantry began loading for another operation. For the next few days, the 163rd patrolled further inland and would fall into a heavy engagement at Kamti on the 29th. At the Kapom villages, about 12 miles up the Raiu River, elements of the 3rd Battalion encountered the only signs of organized Japanese resistance found in the Iipe area on May the 4th. At one of these villages, Kamti, some outpost troops of the 3rd Battalion were surrounded by an estimated 200 Japanese, who made a number of harassing attacks on the 28th and 29th. These skirmishes cost the battalion 3 men killed and 2 wounded, while it was estimated the Japanese lost perhaps 90 dead. On the 25th, Colonel Lehman's 2 forward battalions resumed their march, heading through some very dense jungle, being met by sporadic enemy small-arm fire. They eventually dug in around the vicinity of Julianadorp. Meanwhile, Colonel Newman and his 3rd Battalion advanced west along the main road to Nafar, while some LVTs transported his 1st Battalion over Lake Setani to a point on the western shore of Nafar. Neither force faced much opposition, and together they would perform some patrolling of the Cyclops Drum during the afternoon. Back over at Iipe, Colonel Howie's 127th Regiment finished their occupation of Tomleo, Sulio, and the Ali Islands, and were now beginning to send patrols east towards Afia. On the 26th, Colonel Newman had his 1st Battalion seize the Cyclops Drome, while the 2nd Battalion took some LVTs to capture the Santani Drome. Shortly after midday, both battalions rapidly secured the airdromes under light enemy resistance. Despite a serious supply situation, Lyman's 1st and 3rd Battalions resumed their advance, only encountering one enemy bunker at Ebili Plantation. It had been impossible to drop supplies from the air on April the 25th, and even hand carrying had been stopped late in the afternoon by heavy rains, which had flooded many of the small streams. Parts of the Iipe Lake Setani Trail were now knee-deep in water. The 2 forward battalions were very low on ammunition, and they would have to go on half rations if the supply situation was not quickly improved. But General Irving was again optimistic about the weather, believing that air supply would be successful on the 26th. Furthermore, he had received information which indicated the Japanese were evacuating the airfield area. For these reasons, he considered that a continuation of the advance would not be unduly hazardous. In ordering the advance, the divisional commander was knowingly pushing his men far beyond the limit at which they could be supplied by hand carry. If the airdrop should again fail, or if the track conditions should not improve, one of the 2 forward battalions would probably have to be echeloned back along the trail to augment the carrying parties, and the advance would probably have to be halted. Should enemy opposition prove stubborn, the 4 battalions might have to withdraw, perhaps as far as Dazai, to replenish their meager supplies of rations and ammunition. Thus, General Irving was taking a calculated risk, which assumed the success of the airdrop and the absence of a determined Japanese opposition. By the afternoon of the 26th, the Hollandia drome was secured after a successful airdrop at Desai. After this, the objectives of Reckless had been all achieved. Mop-up operations would continue until June the 6th, as Fuller's 41st Division cleared out Cape Soja and the Cyclops Mountain. They would end up flushing out Japanese on Hill 1000, and Irving's 24th Division sent out patrols west towards Merneda, Dempta Bay, and Genjem. By June the 6th, they had killed 405 Japanese and had taken 64 prisoners in the Genjem-Dempta region. Seeing that many of these Japanese troops were actually personnel, not combat troops, you're actually going to see a lot more prisoners taken. It's a rare instance. Many more Japanese were found dead of starvation or disease along the trails in the same area. During that same time period, Eckelberger's task force would develop Hollandia into a major base from which future operations would be supported. In the end, casualties for Operation Reckless amounted to 124 deaths, 1,057 wounded, 28 missing for the Americans. The Japanese suffered 3,300 deaths, 661 captured. You might be thinking to yourself, these are extremely large numbers for an episode where we've barely talked about any combat action. The reality is, there is just so many men involved in this action, with so many smaller units engaging each other, that it just resulted in general casualties. Given the large number, statistically, it's not abnormal. On April the 30th, 7,220 Japanese from Hollandia's garrison would assemble at Genjem, where General Inada began a gradual withdrawal in 11 echelons towards Sarmi. By May the 7th, all echelons departed Genjem for a very long march through some of the worst terrain in New Guinea. 2/3 of the garrison reached the Tor River by June. It's estimated 93% of their strength would succumb to the deadly jungles, lack of provisions, and rampant cases of malaria. Meanwhile, to secure the Tachi airstrips against Japanese attacks from the direction of Wewak, Colonel Howe sent Company C by boat to Nyaparek on April the 28th, where they set up outposts further inland around Charov. By May the 4th, further patrolling by the 127th Regiment had discovered no trace of organized enemy units. Thus, Operation Persecution was successfully completed. During the operation, 525 Japanese were killed, 25 were captured, while the Americans suffered 19 deaths and 40 wounded. But that is all for the New Guinea front, as we are now going to be heading over to New Britain. After the Battle of Talasea, and when the area was secure, Colonel Smith reached the conclusion that the enemy was withdrawing as rapidly as possible to Cape Hoskins. He decided to send patrols to Namundo Plantation. A reconnaissance patrol on March the 10th found enemy positions at Bola and Santa Monica Plantation had been evacuated, but they came upon entrenched enemy positions at Guerrilli. On the 11th, Captain Andrew Halden's Company K left Bidukara with orders to proceed to Mundo. On a 3-day patrol, a time estimate that was to prove too optimistic. Company K reached Guerrilli to find it empty of the enemy, but just north of Patanga, they encountered Japanese small arms, automatic weapons, and mortar fire. For 4 days, the Marine Patrol made slow progress, fighting an enemy who made a stand in the heavy vegetation approximately every 200 yards or so, and then withdrew effectively before the advanced guard flankers could close in. On the evening of the 16th, the company entered Kilu, where the Japanese made their final stand. While the two forces battled, a Marine landing craft appeared offshore, and as it approached the beach, the enemy diverted what apparently was a 75mm field gun from the ground action to the naval force. In the boat was Lieutenant Colonel Deacon, who had obtained permission from Colonel Smith to transport a section of 81mm mortars to Captain Halden's assistance. Although the Japanese tried to hit the craft, they failed to hit it, and the weapons were landed without any casualties. Shortly after, heavy mortars began lobbing shells towards the enemy. The Japanese broke contact, and the Marines reached Namundo 48 hours later, finding the Turanuma detachment again. The 1st Battalion also set up an ambush at Garu, which would produce enemy dead and prisoners for a while. Company I replaced Company K at Namundo, and in turn was replaced on the 25th of March by the 2nd Battalion. Inasmuch as the enemy continued to straggle eastwards singly in small groups with little or no communications, patrols were kept busy returning over and over again to the same villages and plantations in the hopes of catching unwary Japanese. Such hopes frequently paid off. On the 30th, the 2nd Battalion moved southeast from Namundo to San Remo Plantation, described by one Marine as a very pleasant place. From that point, patrols probed westwards to Kula River and eastward into Cape Hoskins, even as far as Baluma. Overall, the patrols saw 3 men killed and 8 wounded, while accounting for 151 Japanese killed and 68 taken prisoner. Meanwhile, the Matsuda, Komori, and Tunamuna's detachments were all performing withdrawals. Komori dispatched his force to a rendezvous point in successive echelons. He himself left Dipmop with a rearguard back on February the 28th, reaching Ogditni via Vakin on March the 1st. The following morning, he started his hospital patients along the evacuation route and sent a detail of 250 men to Bulawatni to help transport provisions. Yet the Marines at Iboki were becoming increasingly troublesome, though quite unaware that they faced anything more than starving stragglers. When Company A of the 1st Marines entered Talawaga on the 5th, Colonel Sato felt the hot breath of pursuit on his neck, and he moved to the Trail Fork where he assumed command of the combined force. The next morning, the Komori group resumed its withdrawal in a northwesterly direction, along the right prong of the Trail Fork, while Sato prepared to follow his command on the 7th. At this point, the ways of these two officers parted, and henceforth each pursued his individual course towards the destiny that awaited him. On the 6th, the Komori group, with Major Tabuse's 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, in the lead, covered 16 kilometers on the trail running northeast from the fork towards the coast to reach what the Japanese called the North Road. After the first day on the trail, Komori's progress became difficult to follow, owing to his use of place names occurring in no other reports or maps. It was slow and difficult at best, because of the rain and the mud, and the necessity for wide detours to find fords through deep streams and safe passages through or around extensive swamps. His immediate force numbered around 200, and on March the 8th, he recorded the Tabuse's battalion at a half-day's march ahead. He sighted occasional enemy reconnaissance planes, and on the 12th, U.S. landing craft fired upon his men as they attempted to cross the Kahu River, obliging them to take the jungle and swamps. The broad Via River stopped his force on the 14th. When improvised rafts refused to float, the Major and 15 others swam across. The rest, through weakness or timidity, declined to follow this excellent example, and it would take 2 days and a wide detour inland to get the whole group to the right bank. Then on the 17th, provisions ran out. Thus the weakening men came by the painful stages to Eleonora Bay, and the welcome of coconuts of Linga Linga plantation on the 21st. But the wide Kapoluk River posed a formidable obstacle to further progress. They first tried to swim the Kapoluk near its mouth, but 18 men of the 2nd Company were swept away and 12 of them drowned, only the captain reaching the far bank safely. A patrol far upstream failed to find any fording point, so the troops spent the rest of the day building rafts. These managed to stay afloat, but broke apart so frequently that another 2 days were required for the passage. They came to a real heartbreaker on the 24th. They reached the Ko, only to find the provisioning post evacuated. On the 25th, an officer patrol encountered a U.S. patrol, and once more the group had to detour. On the 26th, Komori hired a native to guide him to the Namundo plantation, on the eastern base of the Walamis Peninsula. But evidently the man had a change of heart, for the Major recorded it the next day, lacking a guide, he, quote, advanced using a compass. They now entered a region of extensive swamps intersected by another major obstacle, the two-pronged Kula River. The column got across the stream on the 27th, but lost 5 more men in the swift current. The survivors emerged from the swamps on the 29th and followed the river southward. On the 21st, Komori made his final diary entry, eloquent in its marked simplicity. It stated this: "We are very tired and without food." Apparently at this point, malaria laid the Major low. Ordering his men to continue towards Cape Hoskins, he took refuge in a native village, accompanied only by his executive officer, his orderly, and a corporal attached to his headquarters. With no further diary entries, obscurity shrouds the last week of his life. Most of the Japanese forces reached Malalea by the end of March, but Marine patrols were becoming increasingly troublesome. On the 11th, elements of the 1st Marines landed at Linga Linga, patrolling further inland. Company E landed at the Kula River mouth at the base of the Walames Peninsula. There, the Marines encountered 4 enemy stragglers, killing 3 and taking the other prisoner. Then they moved westwards to Kandoka, where they would be joined by 2 platoons of Company F, brought over by boat. There they established a roadblock, just in time to catch Sato's rear echelon. Second Lieutenant Richard Watkins was in command of the trail block. At 9 a.m. Watkins led his group inland from a village over some faint trails, which he hoped the Japanese main body might be using. The Marines had proceeded about a mile and a half, and they were about to cross a stream in a sparsely wooded area, when they sighted 2 Japanese standing with slung rifles, apparently resting. Watkins had about decided to dispose of these when they moved off in a northeasterly direction, followed almost immediately by a large body of their compatriots. Lying where the Japanese could have easily spotted them, the Marines counted about 73 enemy soldiers. Conspicuous among them was a tall, burly officer being carried on a litter. The Japanese were cutting fresh trails through the jungle, and fortunately were too intent on their work to discover the patrol. They made excruciatingly slow progress, however, and Watkins did not dare to move until the last man had disappeared. He then returned with all speed to Kandoka, sending a runner ahead with his report. At the village he met Major Brush, who had come over from Gulali, with 1 squad on what he had attended as merely a routine inspection. He promptly raided his command post to send a rifle platoon and a 60mm motor section to the scene, and he ordered Watkins to hold the trail block with 1 rifle squad, 1 machine gun squad, and 2 motor squads, while he himself set off with the rest of the troops available in an effort to overtake the Japanese from the rear. Before his own departure that morning, Watkins had sent a 6-man patrol under Sergeant Frank Cleek to an inland village 2 miles south of Kandoka, right where the Japanese appeared to be heading. The lieutenant promptly dispatched a native messenger there with a warning. Then, when a firing broke out in that direction, he surmised correctly that Kalik had become engaged and took the remaining rifle squad and hurried to his assistance. He arrived to find the sergeant and his men crouched on some high ground by the east-west trail with dead Japanese all around them. The volume of fire was intense, the pattern not all that clear. As it turned out, Gleek had stumbled upon the column somewhere near its head, and, taking advantage of his superior position, he immediately opened fire. Major Brush's force, which had been closing in rapidly, was on the opposite side of the valley at the time. Hence, at the sound of the first shots, they had hastened to the scene and struck the Japanese column's other flank. In order to avoid becoming involved in the firefight with the group, Watkins ordered Kleek's patrol back to Kandoka and followed with his own squad at a slower pace. Brush caught up with him shortly, and after a counting of heads, miraculously, it seemed the Marines had sustained a single casualty. Watkins recalls this. On the following morning, I took a 20-man patrol through the battle area. We counted 55 dead, including 3 officers. It was quite easy to believe that perhaps 20 more died in the scattered positions throughout the dense underbrush. The dead were within a 100-yard stretch of the trail. We encountered 2 more Japanese who had evidently just came upon the scene, who were sitting side by side, staring dazedly at the destruction, and did not even turn their heads when we approached. The burly officer that they had observed on the litter proved to be Colonel Sato. Evidently, Sergeant Kleek's patrol had struck the enemy column at precisely the point where he was being carried, for the colonel had only had time to leap to his feet and draw his sword to fight back before the Marines' fire riddled him. After seeing their leader fall, those Japanese further forward took off in a mad flight, while those behind were cut off by the converging 2 other patrols. Thus perished one of the few Japanese officers who deserved much credit for the performance of the 65th Brigade under Britain. Although the rear echelon attacked by the 2 patrols compromised less than half of Sato's total force, the group as such ceased to exist with the death of their leader, who alone had held them together. Units split into components, these into smaller parties, straggling eastward over a variety of trails, often hacking their own way by compass. Throughout April, the 17th Division continued their retreat towards Rabaul, managing to repel multiple Marine patrols around Cape Hoskins. General Sakai's survivors finally got to Rabaul between April the 16th and May the 15th, erecting the last bulwark of defense for the South Pacific. On April the 6th, the journey of another Japanese commander would come to an end. The body of the already deceased Major Komori was captured at the San Remo plantation by the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines. They came upon the outpost suddenly face to face with a group of 4 bedraggled Japanese. It was one of those abrupt encounters that allow for little time for reflection or deliberation. The flurry of fire that followed killed 3 of the enemy and wounded the 4th, who promptly surrendered. Komori had apparently died of malaria along the way. For the 5th Marines, their journey was coming to an end as well, so far as New Britain was concerned. With promotion of the regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Booth, he took over as the acting basis, and General Smith returned to Cape Gloucester to relieve General Shepherd as the assistant divisional commander. Units attached to the regiment followed, and representatives of the Army's 185th Infantry arrived to inspect positions, preparing to replace the 5th, just as the 40th Infantry Division's elements were doing so in Cape Gloucester's area, with a view of relieving the entire 1st Marine Division. The last clash of the campaign occurred on the 22nd of April, when a patrol intercepted a party of Japanese, killing 20, including 2 officers, and suffering the regiment's last fatality on New Britain. 3 days later, the whole 185th RCT moved into Tallahassee and San Remo, and at 3:30, the command of the area formally passed to the Army. LCMs carrying the 1st and 3rd Battalions back to Morgan Bay cleared Tallahassee at 4:30, followed by those carrying that patrol from San Remo at about 8 o'clock. The movement was reported complete at 7:30 on the 26th, and men of the 5th learned that the 1st Marines had departed this island of evil memory the previous day, and that they would follow as ships became available. Soon they would be relieved by Major General Isaac Ratbush's 40th Division, which took responsibility for Cape Gloucester, Arroway, and Tallahassee by the end of April. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I just released part 3 of my series on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, this one titled Operation Jinzhou. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel where you can find exclusive podcasts. The last poll is actually a real nail-biter, so I think I'm going to be doing 2 podcasts in the end. The first one is on the wacky story of the Battle of Castle Itter. The second one is about how the century of humiliation shaped the very China we see today. In that one, I will be talking a lot about Xi Jinping. It'll make for an interesting episode. And again, thanks to everybody who's recently joined the Patreon at a real boost lately. You guys are awesome. Thus, Operation Reckless and Persecution were both successful. Now, General Douglas MacArthur had a strong foothold in Western New Guinea, seeing the Japanese continue their frantic retreat wherever the Allied forces seemed to pop up. Over in New Britain, the Japanese were losing formidable commanders as they were too on the retreat. Things were simply disastrous for the Empire of the Rising Sun.